Her face could turn warriors to stone with a single glance. Her severed head became the deadliest weapon in Greek mythology. For nearly 3,000 years, Medusa has been feared, worshipped, and endlessly reimagined, cast as mythology's ultimate monster. But here's what makes her story truly extraordinary. In the 7 centuries between the Greek poet Hesiod and the Roman poet Ovid, Medusa transformed from a monster born of primordial gods into a beautiful maiden cursed for being violated in a temple. Same name, same snake hair, same stone-turning gaze. Completely different origins, radically different meanings. The ancient Greeks told one version, the Romans rewrote her entirely. And modern voices have reimagined her again as a symbol not of monstrosity, but of survival and resistance. 3 drastically different Medusas, separated by centuries and cultures, each revealing profound truths about the societies that shaped her myth. Which version is true? Perhaps all of them, perhaps none. But the evolution of her story, how she changed and why, reveals something far more fascinating than any single telling ever could. Tonight, we trace Medusa's transformation across 28 centuries, from the earliest fragmentary references in Homer's epics to contemporary feminist reinterpretations. We'll explore why the ancient poet Pindar called her fair-cheeked centuries before Ovid described her ravishing beauty. We'll examine the mysterious silence in Hesiod's account about how Poseidon came to lie with her in a soft meadow amid spring flowers. Words that hint at romance, but offer no context. We'll discover how Ovid's retelling, in 8 CE, introduced the rape and curse narrative that now dominates popular understanding, and we'll investigate how 20th century scholars like Hélène Cixous transformed Medusa from victim into icon, from monster into mirror. So settle into this journey with a curious mind and an open heart. Let your breathing slow as we step back through millennia. The story you think you know is just the surface. Beneath it lie layers of meaning, contradiction, and transformation. A myth that refuses to stay fixed, that shape-shifts across cultures and centuries, revealing new truths with each telling. The woman behind the myth awaits, and she has been waiting for someone to truly listen, to see all her faces for nearly 3,000 years. The ancient origins, born of primordial waters. To understand Medusa, we must first travel back to the earliest records of her existence, to a time when the Greek world was still taking shape in verse and clay, when shepherds tended flocks on mountainsides and told stories of gods and monsters to explain the mysteries they witnessed in the world around them. Our journey begins nearly 28 centuries ago, with a shepherd poet named Hesiod, who around 700 BCE compiled one of the most comprehensive genealogies of the gods in his work known as the Theogony. In Hesiod's telling, Medusa was no cursed mortal, no fallen priestess, no victim of divine wrath. She was something older, something stranger, something born from the primordial depths of the sea itself. Hesiod describes her as one of 3 sisters, known collectively as the Gorgons, daughters of Phorcys and Ceto, ancient deities who embodied the hidden dangers and dark mysteries of the ocean's depths. These were not the graceful sea nymphs of later Greek imagination, dancing through waves with shells and pearls. Phorcys and Ceto represented the oldest, most primal aspects of the sea. The crushing darkness of the abyss, the sudden storms that swallowed ships whole, the creatures with too many teeth that rose from places where sunlight never reached. Their offspring reflected this terrifying nature, beings that existed at the boundaries of what was known and what was feared. The Gorgons, according to Hesiod, lived beyond the edge of the known world, past the great river of ocean that the Greeks believed encircled all lands, in a frontier region where night gathered perpetually, and the clear-voiced Hesperides tended their golden apples in eternal twilight. The three sisters were named Athena, Euryale, and Medusa. Their very names carried weight and meaning that would have resonated deeply with ancient Greek audiences. Stheno, whose name derives from the Greek word for strength or might, embodied raw, unstoppable force, the kind of power that could not be reasoned with or negotiated. Euryale, meaning wide wandering or of the wide sea, represented the vast, unknowable expanses of the ocean, the sense of being lost in something too large to comprehend. And Medusa, a name that comes from the ancient Greek verb meaning to guard or to protect, carried within it a terrible irony that would echo through every retelling of her story. She was named protector, guardian, but who would she guard, and who would guard her? Of the three sisters, two were immortal. Stheno and Euryale could not die, could not be wounded, could not be conquered by any means known to gods or men. They would exist forever in their monstrous forms, eternal guardians of their impossible realm at the world's edge. But Medusa was mortal. She alone could bleed. She alone could die. She alone was vulnerable. This single detail would become the cornerstone of every myth that followed. For in the world of Greek heroes, a mortal monster represented not a tragedy, but an opportunity, a challenge waiting to be accepted, a quest waiting to be undertaken, a trophy waiting to be claimed. Hesiod tells us little else about Medusa's nature or appearance in those early verses. He does mention, almost in passing, that Poseidon, the dark-haired god of the sea, lay with her in a soft meadow amid spring flowers. The phrase is striking, pastoral, almost romantic. But Hesiod provides no details about the circumstances of this encounter. No explanation for how or why it occurred. No exploration of consent or coercion. No context beyond these few evocative words. Modern scholars have debated extensively what Hesiod meant by this brief passage. The language he uses, particularly the phrase lay with, appears in Greek literature to describe both consensual unions and forced ones, leaving the nature of the encounter ambiguous. Some interpreters argue that the soft meadow and spring flowers suggest a willing encounter, a romantic tryst between sea god and sea-born Gorgon. Others contend that the power imbalance between an immortal god and a mortal creature, combined with Medusa's lack of voice in the narrative, implies coercion, even if not explicitly stated. Still, others suggest that Hesiod, writing in a culture with very different concepts of consent than our own, may not have considered the distinction important enough to clarify. What we can say with certainty is this: Hesiod's account leaves the question open. In his version, Medusa simply exists as she is from birth, monstrous, mortal among immortals, destined to bear children she would never raise, and marked for death by a hero not yet born when these words were first sung. Whether her encounter with Poseidon was violation or romance, Hesiod does not tell us. The silence itself has become part of the myth, a space where later interpreters would project their own understanding of power, gender, and divine prerogative. What Hesiod does make clear is that the Gorgons inspired universal terror. To look upon them was to court death itself, instant and irreversible. Their very appearance could transform living flesh to lifeless stone, could freeze warriors mid-stride, could turn screams of horror into eternal silence, statues that would weather and erode over centuries, but never again draw breath. They were emblems of the ultimate fear, the irreversible transformation, the moment when life becomes monument, when consciousness becomes cold mineral, when everything you are simply stops. Other early poets echoed this fear, adding their own details and emphases to the growing mythology. Homer, writing even earlier than Hesiod in the 8th century BCE, mentions the Gorgon in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, though he speaks of only one Gorgon rather than 3 sisters. In the Iliad, the head of the Gorgon appears on the aegis, the protective shield or breastplate of Athena, described as the head of the grim, gigantic Gorgon, a thing of fear and horror. The repetition of those words, fear and horror, suggests that no single term could capture what the Gorgon represented. She required doubling, emphasis, a heaping of dreadful adjectives just to approximate the response she inspired. In the Odyssey, Odysseus, while visiting the underworld and speaking with the shades of the dead, expresses his terror that Persephone might send up an awful monster's grisly head to drive him away from the realm of the dead. Even in Hades, even among ghosts and shades, even in a place already defined by death, the Gorgon's head represents something more terrible, something that could horrify even those already beyond life's concerns. The playwright Aeschylus, writing in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, describes the Gorgons in his tragedy Prometheus, bound as 3 winged sisters, loathed enemies of humankind, the snake-haired Gorgons, whom no man can see and live. This phrase, whom no man can see and live, captures the essence of the early Medusa myth perfectly. She is fundamentally unknowable, unseeable, a creature defined entirely by the impossibility of facing her, of meeting her gaze, of seeing her as she truly is and surviving the encounter. She exists in the realm of things that cannot be witnessed, experiences that cannot be shared, knowledge that cannot be obtained without paying the ultimate price. The poet Pindar, writing in the early 5th century BCE, adds another dimension to the mythology. In his 12th Pythian ode, he tells of how the goddess Athena invented the double-piped flute, the aulos, to recreate the haunting lament of Medusa's sisters after her death. According to this tradition, Athena witnessed Euryale and Sthenos' grief, heard their terrible wailing, and was moved to capture that sound in music. It's a strangely humanizing detail in otherwise monstrous accounts. This image of sisters mourning, of immortal beings experiencing loss, of a goddess being touched by grief enough to honor it through art. Pindar also mentions something that later writers would seize upon: and that has sparked considerable scholarly debate. He refers to Medusa as fair-cheeked or beautiful-cheeked, depending on the translation. This single phrase from the early 5th century BCE has generated extensive discussion among classicists. What did Pindar mean? Did he envision Medusa as possessing elements of beauty despite her monstrous features? A creature with a lovely face, but snake hair and terrifying powers? Was he referencing an earlier tradition now lost to us that portrayed Medusa as transformed from beautiful to monstrous, predating Ovid's version by centuries? Or might fair-cheeked have carried different connotations in ancient Greek that don't translate cleanly to our modern understanding? The text itself doesn't elaborate, leaving us with tantalizing ambiguity. What we can say with certainty is that by the 5th century BCE, nearly 2 centuries before Ovid wrote, at least some Greek sources were associating Medusa with beauty alongside terror. This reference would prove significant, opening the door for later interpretations that emphasized Medusa's tragic beauty rather than pure monstrosity. But we must be cautious about reading too much into Pindar's brief phrase. Ancient Greek aesthetic categories didn't always align with our modern concepts, and without more context, we're left to speculate about precisely what fair-cheeked meant to Pindar's original 5th century BCE audience. Yet for all these early accounts, the fear and fascination Medusa inspired in Greek poets and audiences, the ancient writers tell us remarkably little about her as an individual. She is grouped with her sisters, described in collective terms as the Gorgons, defined by what she does, turning people to stone rather than who she is. We learn nothing of her thoughts, her feelings, her daily existence at the edge of the world. Did she hate what she had become? Did she ever long for different powers, a different face, a different fate? The early Greeks seemed content with Medusa as symbol, as cautionary figure, as the ultimate unfaceable threat. She needed no backstory, no explanation, no humanizing details. She simply was, and that was terrible enough. But humans have never been content with monsters that lack motivation, with evil that has no origin story. We crave narratives that make sense, that offer reasons, that show us how the terrible came to be. We want to know why the villain is villainous. What made the monster monstrous? And so, as the centuries rolled on, as Greek culture gave way to Roman influence, as new poets sought new angles on ancient stories and new ways to captivate audiences who had heard the old tales too many times, Medusa's myth would be reimagined, rewritten, given depth and tragedy, and a devastating origin that would transform her from primordial monster into something that cuts far closer to the bone, a victim. The transformation, Ovid's devastating reimagining. The story changed when Rome inherited Greece's gods and gave them Latin names and new narratives to match Roman sensibilities and concerns. More than 7 centuries after Hesiod first wrote of Medusa's birth from sea deities, a Roman poet would fundamentally alter her mythology forever, creating a version that would dominate Western understanding of the Gorgon for the next 2,000 years and counting. His name was Publius Ovidius Naso, known to us as Ovid, and his monumental work, the Metamorphoses, completed around 8 CE, would reshape how the Western world understood not just Medusa, but the very nature of transformation punishment and divine justice. In Book 4 of the Metamorphoses, Ovid presents a radically different Medusa. The account appears as part of Perseus's wedding feast, where the hero recounts his adventures to his new bride Andromeda and her assembled guests. It's worth noting here that scholars debate certain details of Ovid's account. While popular retellings often describe Medusa as a priestess of Athena, Ovid's Latin text does not explicitly use this term. What he does state clearly is that Medusa was exceptionally beautiful, particularly renowned for her hair, and that Neptune, the Roman name for Poseidon, violated her in Minerva's temple. The priestess designation, though widely accepted in modern interpretations, may represent a logical inference. What else would explain a young woman's presence in a temple, rather than Ovid's explicit statement? This distinction matters because it shows how even scholarly retellings can add details, however reasonably, that weren't in the original text. In the 4th book of the Metamorphoses, Ovid recounts the tale of Perseus, the hero who would slay Medusa and become famous for that deed above all others. But Ovid, always drawn to the personal and the psychological, always interested in the inner lives of his characters and the complicated emotions that drive divine and human action, couldn't resist adding a backstory, an origin for Medusa's monstrous transformation. And what he created was not just a myth, but a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about power, violation, and the cruel mechanics of blame that should feel ancient and distant, but instead ring with contemporary familiarity. The scene occurs at Perseus's wedding feast to Andromeda, the princess he saved from a sea monster, using Medusa's severed head as a weapon. The hall is filled with guests, wine flows freely, and the mood is celebratory. As is customary at such events, stories are told, and the guests admire the terrible trophy that made Perseus's heroism possible. Someone asks a question that must have seemed innocent, merely curious. Why did Medusa, alone among her sisters, have serpents twining through her hair? What made her different? What caused her transformation? Perseus answers, and through him, through this casual wedding conversation, Ovid tells us a story Hesiod never knew or never chose to tell. Medusa, Perseus claims, was once ravishingly beautiful, the jealous aspiration of many suitors who came from distant lands simply to glimpse her. Her beauty was so renowned that men traveled for weeks, crossed dangerous seas, climbed treacherous mountain passes, all for the chance to see her face, to hear her voice, to perhaps win her favor. But she rejected them all, remaining devoted to her role as a priestess in Athena's temple, committed to serving the goddess of wisdom and remaining chaste as her position required. Her greatest beauty, the feature that inspired the most admiration and desire, the aspect of her appearance that was most praised by those who saw her, was her hair. Flowing locks that caught the light, that moved like silk, that were said to rival even the goddess Athena's own tresses in their luster and perfection. This detail is crucial, for it sets up the specific nature of her curse, the particular cruelty of what would be done to her. Then came Poseidon, the lord of the sea, master of earthquakes and horses, one of the three great brothers who divided the cosmos among themselves after overthrowing the Titans. In Ovid's telling, where all the gods have Latin names. He was better known as Neptune. The gods saw Medusa, perhaps while she was performing her duties in Athena's temple, perhaps as she walked through the streets on some errand of devotion. He saw her and desired her. And because he was a god, because he was powerful, because he was accustomed to taking what he wanted when he wanted it, because the ancient world operated on principles of power that we would now call criminal, he took what he wanted without asking, without permission, without concern for consequences. Ovid uses the Latin word vitiare, which translates to violate or defile. Some translations soften this to seduced, or even simply lay with, potentially glossing over the violence in the original language. Ovid introduces slight uncertainty by reporting the act indirectly, using dicitur, meaning it is said, which could indicate he's drawing on existing tradition, or perhaps suggesting some distance from the account. Most modern scholars read the passage as describing an assault, though the ambiguity in Ovid's phrasing has allowed for various interpretations over the centuries. The crucial detail comes next, the element that triggers everything that follows. This violation occurred in Athena's temple, in the sacred space dedicated to the virgin goddess of wisdom and war, in the very place where Medusa served and worshipped. Poseidon didn't just assault Medusa, he did so in a location that would ensure maximum insult to Athena, whether that was his intention or merely his indifference to where he committed his crime. And here is where the story takes its most devastating turn. Athena, discovering this desecration of her holy place, was filled with rage. But she could not punish Poseidon. He was an older god, more powerful in the cosmic hierarchy, her uncle and one of the original 3 brothers who ruled the universe. Whether Athena felt constrained by divine protocol or simply couldn't challenge Poseidon's power, the result was the same. She turned her fury on the only person involved who was vulnerable enough to face consequences without cosmic repercussions. The goddess transformed Medusa's beautiful hair, the feature that had drawn so much admiration, and that Poseidon had presumably desired, into a nest of writhing, venomous serpents. She made Medusa's face so terrible that anyone who looked upon it would turn instantly to stone, ensuring that Medusa could never again walk among people, never receive comfort or companionship, never be seen as anything but monstrous. She stripped away Medusa's humanity, her beauty, her identity, everything that made her who she was, and cast her out as a monster, to be feared and shunned, exiled to the edge of the world, where she could harm no one, but where she would also be utterly, completely alone. Medusa was transformed from a priestess into a gorgon, from a woman into a weapon of terror, from a victim into something that would be called evil, something that heroes would be praised for destroying. Her curse wasn't death, which might have been merciful. It was transformation into a being that could never die of natural causes, but would have to live on, isolated and monstrous, until someone finally came to end her suffering and call it heroism. Ovid's account is striking in what it exposes about ancient Roman and Greek attitudes toward sexual violence and female autonomy, about how societies decide who deserves punishment and who deserves protection. The story doesn't end with Athena punishing Medusa. It continues with Perseus hunting her down and beheading her, with the goddess accepting that severed head and mounting it on her shield as a protective emblem. carrying it into battle as a symbol of divine power. Even in death, Medusa serves. Even in silence, her mutilated face becomes a tool for others' purposes, a weapon wielded by the very goddess who cursed her, protecting Athena from threats, while Athena had offered Medusa no protection at all. What makes Ovid's version particularly powerful and particularly disturbing is that it reframes the entire Perseus myth in ways that raise uncomfortable questions. In the older versions, Perseus is the straightforward hero who defeats a monster threatening the world, making it safe for civilization to flourish. But in Ovid's telling, Perseus becomes something more complicated. A man hunting down a woman who has already been punished for a crime she didn't commit, using divine weapons and aid from the very goddess who cursed her, tracking her to her place of exile and murdering her while she sleeps. The hero's quest becomes something darker, something that resonates uncomfortably with modern understandings of how victims are often vilified, how trauma is compounded by society's response to it, how the powerful always find ways to make their violence acceptable and even praiseworthy. It's important to note that Ovid was not the first to suggest Medusa hadn't always been monstrous. The 5th century BCE poet Pindar had already referred to the fair-cheeked Medusa, implying beauty alongside terror, suggesting that even in her monstrous form, traces of loveliness remained, or that she had once been beautiful before something changed her. Classical Greek art from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE increasingly depicted Medusa not as the grotesque bearded creature of earlier archaic art, but as a beautiful woman, sometimes sleeping peacefully even as Perseus approached to strike the fatal blow. These images predate Ovid by centuries, suggesting that the idea of Medusa's tragic beauty, of her being something other than born monstrous, was already circulating in Greek culture long before the Roman poet wrote his version. But Ovid crystallized this tradition into narrative, gave it the weight of violation and divine injustice, made the transformation a punishment rather than merely a characteristic. He took an existing artistic trend toward beautifying Medusa and provided it with a story that explained not just why she was beautiful, but why she became monstrous. And in doing so, he created one of Western culture's most enduring tales of victim blaming, a pattern that would be repeated in countless other contexts for the next 2,000 years. Other ancient sources offer different reasons for Athena's curse, though none are significantly less troubling when examined closely. Pseudo-Apollodorus, writing in the 2nd century CE, suggests that Medusa was beheaded because Athena was jealous, the mortal woman having boasted that her own hair was more beautiful than the goddesses. This version transforms the tale into one of vanity and divine pettiness, removing the element of sexual violence, but replacing it with a punishment that seems wildly disproportionate to the offense. Claiming to be beautiful enough to rival a goddess earns you transformation into a monster? The message about female pride and ambition remains troubling. Some earlier Greek writers, including a 5th century BCE author named Pherecydes, whose works survive only in fragments and references by later authors, also seem to have known a version where Medusa was cursed for boasting about her beauty. This suggests that multiple traditions existed simultaneously, some emphasizing violation, others emphasizing pride, but all agreeing that Medusa's transformation was a punishment inflicted by Athena, and that, whatever the reason, Medusa paid a terrible price for something that shouldn't have destroyed her life. But it is Ovid's version that seized the Western imagination and has refused to let go for 2 millennia. His Medusa is the one that appears again and again in art, literature, and modern retellings. She is the priestess violated, the victim blamed, the woman punished for the crimes of a more powerful man. She is, in many ways, the story that every victim of sexual violence knows too well. The narrative of being harmed and then being made to carry the burden of that harm, of becoming the problem rather than the person who was wronged, of being transformed in others' eyes from person to pariah. Ovid's transformation of the myth also reveals something important about the fluidity of ancient storytelling and how myths functioned in Greek and Roman culture. The Greeks and Romans didn't have a single canonical version of their myths the way modern religious texts often claim singular authority. Stories evolved, changed, adapted to new cultural contexts and the interests of new tellers. Different cities had different versions of the same myths, emphasizing local heroes or gods. Different poets added details or changed motivations to suit their artistic purposes or the tastes of their audiences. Ovid wasn't corrupting an original tale by adding the rape narrative. He was participating in an ongoing tradition of mythological innovation, of finding new meanings and new relevance in old stories. His version succeeded not because it was authentic in any original sense, but because it was emotionally powerful, because it offered a compelling explanation for Medusa's transformation that resonated with what Romans understood about divine justice and female vulnerability, and because, perhaps, it spoke to something Roman audiences recognized about the precarious position of women in their society, where a woman's reputation could be destroyed by circumstances beyond her control, where being assaulted could result in social death as surely as actual death. The irony, of course, the detail that cuts deepest when you pause to consider it, is that Medusa's name means protector or guardian. It derives from the ancient Greek verb medo, meaning to guard or protect. So the woman whose very name designated her as protector was left unprotected by the gods, by society, by the narrative itself. The woman who would become the ultimate protective symbol, her face used to ward off evil on shields and doorways and amulets across the entire Mediterranean world for centuries, could not protect herself from the evil that was done to her. The guardian could not be guarded. The protector could not be protected. The irony is almost too painful to contemplate. And this is where Medusa's story begins to transcend its ancient origins and speak to every age, every culture, every generation that has witnessed or experienced the pattern Ovid describes. Because the pattern of assault followed by blame, of the victim transformed into the villain, of power protecting power, while the vulnerable bear the consequences. This is not a relic of ancient Rome or archaic Greece. This is not mythology in the sense of something that only happened long ago in a time of gods and monsters. It is a pattern that repeats across cultures and centuries, a story that gets retold in courtrooms and newsrooms and whispered conversations, wherever victims are told they asked for it, They deserved it. They should have known better. They should have been more careful. They should take some responsibility for what happened to them. Medusa's transformation in Ovid's hands becomes a story about how societies create monsters, how trauma is compounded by injustice, how the powerful write the narratives that justify their own actions while erasing the agency and humanity of those they harm. And in becoming this story, in taking on these layers of meaning and contemporary resonance, Medusa evolves from a simple monster of Greek myth into something far more dangerous to those who would prefer victims stay silent. A symbol of rage that cannot be contained, a gaze that cannot be avoided, a truth that turns comfortable assumptions to stone. The woman who couldn't speak for herself in the original myths now speaks volumes through her silence, through the questions her story raises, through the discomfort it creates in anyone who examines it honestly. She asks us, who do we believe? Who do we blame? Who do we protect? And whose stories do we tell? The face of terror, evolution in ancient art. While poets were crafting narratives about Medusa, weaving her story through their verses and giving her motivations or denying her humanity depending on their purposes, visual artists were creating her face, rendering her in clay and stone and bronze and paint. The images they produced reveal as much about changing cultural attitudes as any text, perhaps more, for art speaks in a language that transcends words, communicating through form and expression, and the visceral response of viewer experiences when confronted with an image. The artistic depictions of Medusa underwent a remarkable transformation across the centuries, from monstrous and grotesque to increasingly humanized and beautiful. And each stage of this evolution tells us something about how the ancient Greeks and Romans understood monstrosity, femininity, power, and the relationship between terror and beauty. Art doesn't just reflect culture, it shapes it, teaching people what monsters look like, what heroes should do, what constitutes beauty and what constitutes threat. In the earliest representations, from the archaic period of Greek art spanning roughly the 8th through early 5th centuries BCE, Medusa is portrayed as almost comically terrifying, though the effect on ancient viewers would have been anything but comic. These early gorgons appear on temple pediments, decorative roof tiles called antefixes, pottery sherds and vases, coins and shield decorations, always with a distinctive and unforgettable face that seems designed to shock and disturb. Picture a round, wide visage with enormous bulging eyes that stare directly forward at the viewer, an unusual frontal gaze in a culture where almost all figures were depicted in profile or three-quarter view. The mouth is stretched in a grotesque grin, wide and unnatural, revealing sharp fangs and tusks like a wild boar's, with the tongue often protruding and lolling to one side, as if the gorgon is mocking the viewer's horror. Many archaic gorgons sport full beards, combining masculine and feminine features in a way that would have been deeply unsettling to Greek viewers for whom gender categories were rigidly defined and carefully policed. The mixing of male and female characteristics signaled chaos, a breakdown of natural order, something fundamentally wrong with the world. The body, when shown in full rather than just as a head, is typically depicted in what scholars call the pinwheel or knilaf pose. A running position with limbs bent at impossible angles, knees high, arms crooked, suggesting violent motion and barely contained energy. It's a pose that appears nowhere in nature, that no human or animal body could actually achieve, emphasizing the Gorgon's otherworldly nature. Often, wings sprout from the Gorgon's back, and sometimes from her heels as well, emphasizing her ability to fly, to traverse boundaries, to move between the mortal world and whatever realm monsters properly inhabit. These early Gorgons weren't meant to be realistic representations of any being, mythical or otherwise. They were apotropaic symbols, images designed to frighten and repel, to ward off evil through their own concentrated dose of ugliness and terror. The Greek word gorgos, from which Gorgon derives, means terrible, fierce, and grim. Every exaggerated feature, every impossible angle, every grotesque detail served the purpose of creating an image so disturbing that evil itself would turn away. The logic went, if you want to ward off something dangerous, you need an image of something even more dangerous. Evil repels evil. Fear fights fear. The Gorgoninion, the image of Medusa's severed head, became one of the most common protective symbols in ancient Greece, serving roughly the same function as mezuzahs in Jewish tradition, crosses in Christianity, or evil eye amulets in Mediterranean cultures. It appeared on temple roofs to protect sacred spaces from desecration, on shields to terrify enemies in battle, and cause them to hesitate at the crucial moment, on tomb markers to guard the dead from disturbance or theft, and on everyday objects from wine cups to door knockers, from ovens to coins. The ubiquity of the image speaks to how deeply the Greeks believed in its protective power. But something remarkable began to happen during the classical period of Greek art, roughly the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, a period we often call the Golden Age of Greece. As Greek culture shifted towards celebrating idealized human forms, as sculptors like Phidias and Praxiteles perfected the art of rendering the human body in graceful, harmonious proportions, as philosophers developed increasingly sophisticated ideas about beauty and perfection, the depictions of Medusa began to change in ways that seem almost inevitable in retrospect, but must have been striking to those who first witnessed them. Her features softened. The grotesque elements that had defined the archaic Gorgon slowly disappeared or were minimized. The beard vanished entirely, replaced by smooth feminine cheeks. The protruding tongue was drawn back into the mouth. The sharp fangs became normal teeth, or were hidden behind shapely, gently curved lips. The bulging eyes took on a more human proportion, though they retained their distinctive frontal gaze. That much remained constant, that direct confrontation with the viewer that made Medusa's image so powerful and so unsettling, no matter how beautiful she became. This transformation wasn't unique to Medusa. Other hybrid creatures in Greek mythology, the sirens who lured sailors to their deaths with beautiful song, the sphinxes who guarded roads and asked impossible riddles, even the sea monster Scylla who devoured sailors from her cave, all underwent similar beautification during this period. Scholars generally attribute this shift to the aesthetic preferences of classical Greek art, which favored idealized beauty and harmonious proportions, even when depicting monsters and threats. The Greeks of this period believed that beauty revealed truth, that the gods had structured the universe according to mathematical principles that manifested as visual harmony. Even monsters in this worldview could be beautiful, perhaps should be beautiful, because everything that existed was part of a cosmos that tended toward order and aesthetic perfection. But the change in Medusa's appearance also coincided with, and perhaps enabled, the emergence of her tragic backstory. The versions of her myth that emphasized her transformation from beautiful woman to monster. It's much easier to tell a story about a beautiful woman cursed into monstrosity if you can actually depict that woman as beautiful. If audiences can see in her monstrous face traces of the loveliness she once possessed. The beautification of Medusa in art created space for the tragic narrative that Ovid would later crystallize in verse. One of the earliest examples of this new approach comes from a vase attributed to the painter Polygnotus, dated to around 450 BCE. It shows Perseus approaching Medusa to behead her, but instead of a grotesque monster that clearly deserves to be slain, we see a beautiful woman sleeping peacefully. She has regular human features, though her hair includes serpents, and she retains small wings at her temples as markers of her divine or monstrous nature. The scene is almost tender in its composition, and scholars have long debated whether it was meant to evoke sympathy for Medusa, to make viewers question whether Perseus's act was truly heroic, or to mock Perseus for his unheroic attack on a sleeping, defenseless creature, however monstrous. The ambiguity itself is significant. It suggests that by the mid-5th century BCE, Greeks were already uncomfortable with the simple narrative of hero slays monster. Were already asking questions about justice and heroism that the older myths hadn't troubled to address. By the Hellenistic and Roman periods, from the late 4th century BCE onward through the 1st century CE, Medusa's beauty became her defining characteristic in art, though she remained recognizably a gorgon through the serpents in her hair and her frontal gaze. The famous Medusa Rondinini, a Roman copy of a Greek original now housed in Munich's Glyptothek, shows a serene, lovely face framed by gently waving hair through which small snakes are subtly integrated, almost like decorative elements. Her expression is melancholic, even anguished, but she is unmistakably beautiful by classical standards. Her eyes meet the viewers with what seems like sadness rather than rage, as if she's asking to be understood rather than feared. This is the Medusa that would dominate later artistic imagination, from Renaissance sculptures to modern fashion logos. Beautiful, tragic, complex. Yet even as Medusa became beautiful, she retained her power and her distinctiveness. The frontality remained absolute. In almost all depictions, whether archaic or classical, grotesque or beautiful, Medusa stares directly at the viewer. This was extremely unusual in Greek and Roman art, where figures were almost always shown in profile or three-quarter view, looking away from or past the viewer, rather than engaging them directly. The conventions of ancient art dictated that figures exist in their own space, their own world, not acknowledging the viewer's presence. But Medusa breaks this rule consistently across centuries and artistic traditions. By meeting our eyes, she breaks the fourth wall before theater even invented the term. She challenges us, refuses to be safely observed from a distance, as if she were merely an object or a decoration. Her gaze, even rendered in stone or clay or bronze, even when she's depicted as beautiful and sleeping, carries the threat of her myth embedded within it. To look at Medusa is to be looked back at, and in that exchange, that meeting of gazes, lies the heart of her power. She sees you seeing her, and that mutual recognition is dangerous, transformative, real, in a way that other mythological images are not. The Gorgonean continued to serve its protective function, even as its appearance evolved from grotesque to lovely. Athena, the goddess who cursed Medusa, wore the Gorgon's head prominently on her aegis, the divine breastplate or shield that Zeus himself had given her, and that she bore into every battle. Homer describes it in the Iliad as displaying the head of the grim, gigantic Gorgon, a thing of fear and horror. But by the classical period, artists were depicting Athena's Gorgonean as increasingly beautiful, the goddess wearing the lovely face of her destroyed priestess into battle. This placement on Athena's armor made Medusa's face one of the most recognizable symbols in Greek culture, visible whenever the goddess of wisdom and war was depicted in sculpture, pottery, or relief carving, which was often, as Athena was one of the most popular subjects in Greek art. Warriors affixed Gorgonea to their shields and armor throughout Greek and Roman military history. The theory, the tactical thinking, was that Medusa's petrifying gaze, even in image form, would transfix enemies in battle, causing them to hesitate or break formation at crucial moments. Whether this psychological warfare actually worked in practice is impossible to know. We have no interviews with ancient soldiers about whether seeing a Gorgonean on an enemy's shield made them more likely to flee or freeze. But the fact that the practice continued for centuries, that Gorgonea appear on military equipment from every period of Greek and Roman warfare, suggests soldiers and commanders believed in its efficacy. Belief itself can be a weapon, and if your enemy believes looking at your shield will turn them to stone, their hesitation might be enough to give you the advantage you need. Even now, in museums around the world, you can see ancient Greek bronze greaves, the shin guards worn by hoplites in phalanx formation, with Medusa's face positioned right over the knee, presumably to protect that vulnerable joint while unsettling anyone who came near enough to strike it. Imagine being in battle, locked in close combat, about to strike at your opponent's leg, and suddenly you're staring into Medusa's eyes, rendered in bronze, her gaze meeting yours in that moment of violence. Even knowing she's not real, even knowing it's just decoration, there would be a flash of recognition, of primal fear, of hesitation that could mean the difference between life and death. Architecture made extensive use of Medusa as well. In Sicily and southern Italy, regions of Greek colonization known as Magna Graecia, where Greek culture mixed with indigenous Italian traditions, temple builders commissioned elaborate antefixes, terracotta ornaments covering the ends of roof tiles, featuring Medusa's face. These would be visible from the ground, their exaggerated features and bold colors, typically black, white, and red, that have faded now but would have been vivid when new, ensuring they could be seen and recognized by anyone approaching the sacred building. The message was clear and unmistakable. This space is protected. This sanctuary is guarded. Divine power watches over this place, and Medusa's eyes are watching you. Approach with respect or face the consequences. The image spread beyond Greek borders as Greek culture interacted with and influenced neighboring civilizations. The Etruscans, the sophisticated civilization that preceded and influenced Roman dominance in Italy, adopted Medusa enthusiastically, incorporating her into their own artistic traditions and religious practices. The Romans, when they absorbed both Etruscan and Greek culture into their own syncretic mythology, continued and expanded the tradition. Medusa appears in Roman mosaics on floors where visitors would walk over her face, in jewelry worn for protection and fashion, on coins circulating throughout the empire, and in public monuments declaring Roman power and divine favor. The Basilica Cistern in Constantinople, the ancient underground reservoir built in the 6th century CE to store water for the imperial capital, features two massive Medusa heads carved in stone, used upside down and sideways as column bases in the dark, dripping cavern. Their exact purpose and symbolism are still debated by scholars. Were they apotropaic, protecting the water supply? Were they simply convenient blocks of carved stone, repurposed from older buildings? Were they deliberately inverted as a way of neutralizing Medusa's power while still acknowledging it? The mystery adds to their power. These huge stone faces in the darkness, water dripping onto them for centuries. Medusa's expression unchanging through the rise and fall of empires. This artistic evolution across nearly 1,000 years of Greek and Roman culture reveals something profound about how societies process the concept of the monstrous feminine, about how we visualize and cope with threats that seem to combine beauty and danger, attraction and repulsion, the human and the inhuman. The early Greeks created a Medusa who was pure otherness, barely human, deliberately ugly, designed to shock and repel. They needed a monster that looked like a monster, something that couldn't be confused with a person you might know or a threat you might not recognize. But as Greek culture became more sophisticated, as it developed more complex ideas about beauty, tragedy, the human condition, and the relationship between appearance and reality, Medusa couldn't remain purely monstrous. She had to become more like us, had to have a face we could recognize, features we could relate to, a beauty we could understand losing. The beautification of Medusa represents a deepening of cultural, psychological complexity, an acknowledgement that the most dangerous monsters might not be the ones who look monstrous, but the ones who look like us, who could be us under different circumstances, whose monstrosity is not intrinsic, but created by forces beyond their control. The beautification of Medusa doesn't diminish her as a symbol or reduce her power. In many ways, it intensifies both. A grotesque monster is frightening, certainly, but ultimately alien, easy to dismiss as simply evil, as something that belongs to a different category of being entirely. We can destroy such monsters without moral complexity, without questioning our heroism, without wondering if perhaps they deserve our sympathy as much as our fear. But a beautiful woman transformed into a monster is tragic, is human, is uncomfortably close to the structures of power and victimization that the audience might recognize from their own world, their own experiences, their own fears about what could be done to them if they angered the wrong person or caught the wrong attention. When Medusa is beautiful, when traces of her humanity remain visible beneath or alongside her monstrous features, her story stops being about fighting monsters and starts being about how society creates them, about what happens to women who are desired, violated, blamed, and finally destroyed for the crime of being vulnerable to those with power over them. And perhaps that's why her image persisted so strongly. Why the Gorgonean remained one of the most enduring imbals from ancient Greece long after belief in the actual gods faded, long after temples crumbled and empires fell. Medusa's face, in all its iterations from grotesque to lovely, represented something true about the human experience that transcends any particular culture or time period. Our fear of death and irreversible transformation, our complicated relationship with female power and sexuality, our tendency to create monsters from our own victims and then celebrate their destruction as if we've made the world safer rather than simply eliminating the evidence of our own injustice. Every Medusa rendered in clay or stone or bronze, painted on pottery, or carved into temple pediments, worn on armor or stamped on coins, was a mirror reflecting back not just the face of a myth, but the face of the society that needed that myth. She showed us what we feared and what we desired, what we considered monstrous and what we considered beautiful, and most importantly, how thin the line between those categories could be, how easily beauty could become terror, how quickly the victim could be transformed into the villain in the stories we tell ourselves to justify what we've done. The hero's quest, Perseus and the impossible task. Every monster in Greek mythology exists, at least partly, to be slain by a hero. That's the narrative logic, the structure that gives meaning to both monster and hero. The hero proves his worth by defeating the monster, and the monster's existence justifies the hero's violent action. Medusa's story is no exception to this pattern, but her tale reveals as much about Greek ideas of heroism, masculinity, and what constitutes a truly heroic deed as it does about monsters and fear. It begins, as so many Greek tragedies do, with the dangerous intersection of divine power, mortal desire, and the cruel games gods play with human lives for their own amusement or inscrutable purposes. Perseus was born from precisely such a game, a divine intervention that would shape his entire life and lead him eventually to Medusa's lair. His mother, Danae, was the daughter of Acrisius, king of Argos, one of the great cities of ancient Greece. When Acrisius consulted the oracle at Delphi about his lack of a male heir, for what king doesn't want sons to continue his line and inherit his throne? He received a prophecy that chilled his blood and changed everything. He would have no sons himself, but his grandson would eventually kill him. The specifics varied in different tellings, but the core remained constant. Death would come from his daughter's child. Terrified of this fate and determined to avoid it through any means necessary, Acrisius imprisoned Danae in a bronze chamber underground, or in a high tower, depending on the version, sealed away from all male contact, never to marry or bear children. If she had no children, the prophecy couldn't be fulfilled. Problem solved, or so he thought, demonstrating the kind of short-sighted logic that prophecies love to exploit. But Zeus, king of the gods, lord of thunder and lightning and master of transformation, saw the beautiful princess imprisoned and desired her. Transforming himself into a shower of golden rain, because apparently locked doors mean nothing to gods who can become weather, he infiltrated her prison and impregnated her. The symbolism is rich. Zeus as liquid gold, flowing into every crack and crevice, irresistible and impossible to keep out, the ultimate penetration of boundaries that mortal men think secure. Danae had no say in the matter, but in Greek mythology, divine desire overrides mortal consent as naturally as storm clouds bring rain. When Acrisius discovered his daughter had given birth to a son, naming him Perseus, he faced a profound dilemma. To kill them directly would invite the wrath of Zeus, who, as the infant's father, would presumably take offense at his son's murder. It would also bring the pollution of kin-slaying, one of the gravest crimes in Greek culture, a stain on the soul that could destroy a man and contaminate his entire city. Direct murder was impossible, both practically and morally, by the standards Acrisius lived by. Instead, he chose a solution that was crueler precisely because it created distance between him and the deed. He locked Danae and infant Perseus in a wooden chest, essentially a large sealed box, and cast them into the sea, leaving their survival to the whims of Poseidon and fortune. This way, he told himself, he wasn't killing them. He was simply letting the gods decide their fate. If they died, it wasn't his fault. If they survived, well, at least they'd be far away. Problem solved either way. The chest was both coffin and cradle, both prison and ark, bobbing on the endless waters with mother and child sealed inside, air growing thin, waves crashing over them, death or salvation equally possible with each passing moment. But Zeus intervened, asking Poseidon to calm the waters and guide the chest safely to shore. This divine intervention ensured that Perseus survived, that the prophecy remained possible, that the fate Acrisius sought to avoid stayed on track. The chest eventually washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where a kind fisherman named Dictys discovered the castaways and took them in, raising Perseus as his own alongside his mother. The boy grew strong and courageous on the island, protected by his mother and the fisherman's care, unknown to his grandfather, who presumably thought himself safe, but never truly escaping the fate the oracle had foretold. As Perseus matured into a young man, strong and noble, and devoted to his mother, the dynamics on Seriphos began to shift in dangerous ways. Dictys's brother, King Polydectes, ruled the island, and as Perseus grew, the king's attention turned to Danae with unwelcome intensity. Polydectes desired her, made his intentions clear, but she rejected his advances, protected by her son's fierce loyalty and physical presence. Perseus, now a strong young warrior who could actually defend his mother, was the only obstacle to Polydectes claiming what he wanted. The king recognized the problem and began plotting a solution. He needed to remove Perseus without appearing to harm him. needed the young man gone permanently, but heroically, in a way that couldn't be blamed on the king, in a way that would look like adventure or honor rather than murder or exile. So Polydectes devised a scheme that was clever in its manipulation of honor and masculine pride. He announced his intention to marry a different woman, Hippodamia, and demanded contributions from all his subjects for the traditional wedding gift of horses. Everyone was expected to contribute according to their means to show respect and allegiance to their king. But Perseus, having been raised by a fisherman, had no horses and little wealth. In frustration and perhaps stung by pride, he boasted that he could bring the king anything he asked for, even impossible things, even the head of Medusa herself. It was precisely the kind of rash, foolish boast that young men make when their pride is challenged, when they want to prove they're not less than others, when they don't think through the implications of their words. Polydectes seized on this promise immediately and held Perseus to it, making the quest public, binding the young man by honor and his own words. The king was confident that the impossible quest would result in Perseus's death, leaving Danae unprotected and Polydectes free to claim her. Everyone knew the Gorgons lived at the edge of the world, in a place no mortal could reach. Even if Perseus somehow found them, which seemed impossible, looking at Medusa meant instant death. The quest was designed to fail, designed to rid the king of his problem, while appearing to give Perseus a chance at eternal glory. Perseus, realizing the trap, but bound by his word and by the expectations of masculine honor that Greek culture placed upon young men, prepared to depart on what everyone assumed was a suicide mission. The Gorgons lived at the edge of the known world in a place where geography became mythology. Even if he could find them, approaching them meant death. Facing Medusa meant petrification. The quest seemed impossible by definition, a riddle with no answer, a challenge designed not to be met, but to eliminate the challenger. And perhaps it would have been impossible had Perseus been merely mortal, just another young man whose pride led him into danger. But Perseus was Zeus's son, divine blood flowing through his veins, and the king of the gods would not let his offspring perish on an impossible quest. More importantly, Perseus had caught the attention of two other Olympians who had their own reasons for wanting Medusa dead. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, and Hermes, divine messenger and patron of travelers and tricksters. These two half-siblings of Perseus decided to aid him, though their motivations were complex and not entirely altruistic. Athena, in particular, had her own reasons for wanting Medusa dead: the priestess she had cursed, the woman who reminded her of her own failure to protect her temple or punish the actual perpetrator of its desecration, the living evidence of divine injustice that existed at the world's edge. Helping Perseus destroy Medusa would solve multiple problems at once. The gods, however, couldn't simply kill Medusa themselves. There were rules, hierarchies, divine protocols that even Olympians had to observe. Direct divine intervention in mortal affairs was frowned upon, upset the balance, risked creating precedents that could spiral out of control. Instead, they could arm Perseus with tools no mortal could otherwise possess, could guide him and advise him without actually doing the deed themselves. The blood would be on his hands, not theirs. The glory would be his, and Medusa would still be dead. First, Athena and Hermes whisked Perseus away to the Garden of the Hesperides, a mythical paradise at the world's edge, where the nymphs of evening guarded Hera's golden apples with the help of Ladon, an immortal 100-headed dragon that never slept. This garden existed at the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of pure myth, where normal rules didn't fully apply. The Hesperides, or perhaps nymphs associated with them, sources vary on the details, were persuaded or commanded to give Perseus several crucial items that would make his impossible quest merely incredibly dangerous. First, the winged sandals that would allow him to fly, essential for reaching the Gorgons' lair at the world's edge, and for escaping their pursuit after the deed was done. These weren't just magical boots. They represented the ability to transcend normal mortal limitations, to move as gods move, to cross boundaries that should be uncrossable. Second, the helm of invisibility, sometimes called the cap of Hades, forged by the Cyclopes in the deepest forges of the earth, and belonging to the lord of the underworld himself. This would allow Perseus to approach Medusa unseen by her immortal sisters, who would otherwise tear him apart before he could complete his task. Third, a special pouch called a cabesus, a leather bag that could safely contain Medusa's head after Perseus severed it, preventing him from being turned to stone by his own trophy. The cabesus was more than just a container. It was a liminal space, something that could hold the deadly without contaminating or destroying what held it, a boundary that worked both ways. Athena contributed a polished bronze shield, mirror bright, which would allow Perseus to view Medusa's reflection without meeting her deadly gaze directly. Some versions say Hermes provided an adamantine sword, an unbreakable curved blade known as a harp, capable of cutting through anything, including a Gorgon's neck, in a single stroke. Other accounts suggest the sword came from Hephaestus, the divine smith who crafted all the gods' weapons and tools. Either way, Perseus was being armed with an arsenal no mortal should possess, weapons and tools that blurred the line between human hero and divine agent. But even with divine weapons and magical equipment, Perseus still had to find the Gorgons. Their location was one of the greatest secrets of the ancient world, known only to their sisters, the Graiae, 3 ancient women who lived at an intermediary point between the civilized world and the realm of pure myth. The Graiae were bizarre even by Greek mythological standards. They shared a single eye and a single tooth among the 3 of them, passing these items back and forth to see and eat, ancient from birth with gray hair and wrinkled skin, guardians of secrets about the older, stranger parts of the world. Perseus, guided by Athena and Hermes to the Graiae's cave, watched them carefully, studying their movements and routines. He waited, patient as a hunter, for the moment when they were passing the eye from one sister to another, all 3 temporarily blind in that instant of transfer. Then he struck, snatching the eye away before any of them could take possession of it. The Graiae screamed in fury and desperation. These ancient beings suddenly rendered helpless, unable to see, unable to track their attacker, unable to retrieve what was theirs. But Perseus held the eye hostage, their only means of sight, and made them a deal. He would return it, he promised, only if they told him how to reach the Gorgons, if they revealed the path to that place at the world's edge where their even more terrible sisters dwelt. The sisters, ancient as time itself, wise in ways that mortals could barely understand, had no choice. Blind and helpless, they revealed the path, gave him directions to a place that shouldn't be reachable, that existed at the boundary where geography became nightmare. Perseus gave back their eye as promised, leaving them to continue their strange existence at the margins of reality, and set off with divine sandals and divine guidance toward his impossible goal. Now armed, informed, and determined, Perseus flew on his winged sandals toward the Gorgon's lair. Various accounts place this location differently, inconsistently, as if even the mythology can't quite agree where monsters live. Some say it was at the edge of ocean in the far west, beyond the Hesperides and the setting sun, where the world ended and eternal night began. Others claim it was in Libya, in the heart of North Africa, far beyond the known Greek world, in deserts where no Greek would willingly travel. Still others suggest it was on a distant island somewhere in the unknown sea, where night perpetually gathered and the stars looked wrong. Wherever it was, all the accounts agree it was a place of death, a landscape littered with statues, men and animals turned to stone by Medusa's gaze, frozen forever in positions of terror and flight. These statues weren't art. They were corpses, people who had somehow found their way to this place and made the fatal mistake of looking directly at the Gorgon. They stood as warnings, as deterrents, as evidence of what would happen to Perseus if he failed in his approach, or if any of the divine protections failed him. Perseus found the three sisters sleeping, exhausted or simply resting from their eternal vigilance, their isolation, their cursed existence at the world's edge. Stheno and Uriel flanked their mortal sister, all three dozing in the false security of their isolation, confident that no one could reach them at the world's edge, certain that any who tried would join the stone garden that surrounded their lair long before posing a threat. Here, we must pause to consider what Perseus saw when he looked down at the sleeping Gorgons. If we follow Ovid's version in the artistic tradition that had been developing for centuries, he looked down at a beautiful young woman sleeping peacefully, serpents coiled through her hair, but her features gentle in repose, her face showing no sign of monstrosity except for the snakes and perhaps wings at her temples. She might have been dreaming, possibly of the life she'd lost, the priesthood she'd been exiled from, the violation that had destroyed her humanity. She was vulnerable, unaware, unarmed, alone, despite her sister's presence. If we follow the older traditions that depicted all Gorgons as born monstrous, Perseus still saw a monster, yes, but one who was mortal, vulnerable, asleep, and unaware. Either way, what happened next was not a heroic battle in any traditional sense. There was no struggle, no test of strength or courage, no moment when the outcome hung in balance and could have gone either way. Perseus, wearing the helm of invisibility that made him impossible to see, flying on divine sandals that kept him silent and swift, approached an unarmed sleeping woman and prepared to kill her. He held up Athena's mirror shield, using it to view Medusa's reflection rather than looking at her directly. ensuring he wouldn't meet her gaze and suffer the fate of those stone statues outside. Then, with one stroke of his divine sword, guided perhaps by Athena's own hand, though the myths don't say for certain, he severed her head from her body. The myths tell us that Medusa's death was instant, but several ancient sources add a detail that deepens the tragedy. She was pregnant with Poseidon's children from their union years before. The exact nature of this, how long she had been pregnant, whether the pregnancy was suspended by her transformation, varies between tellings. Some accounts suggest she had been carrying these children since the encounter, unable to give birth in her cursed form. As Perseus's blade cut through her neck, as her head fell into his waiting cabesus, as blood spurted from the stump of her severed neck. From that wound sprang two beings, born from violence in the moment of their mother's final violation. Pegasus, the magnificent white-winged horse, and Chrysaor, often described as a giant bearing a golden sword, though some traditions depict him as a winged boar or some other fantastic hybrid. These children of Poseidon and Medusa emerged fully formed, perfect and complete, never having experienced their mother's embrace, never nursed at her breast, never heard her voice or felt her touch. They were born from death, from the meeting of Perseus's sword and Medusa's neck, from the final destruction of the woman who had carried them. Pegasus would go on to serve the gods, carrying Zeus's thunder and lightning across the sky, creating springs wherever his hooves struck the earth, becoming the mount of heroes like Bellerophon. Chrysaor would father the three-headed giant Geryon, continuing his mother's monstrous lineage in the myths. But neither child would know Medusa, neither would mourn her specifically, neither would question the narrative that their mother was simply a monster that needed to be slain so that heroes could prove their worth and gods could maintain their order. Medusa's immortal sisters woke to find their youngest sibling headless. The grief and rage of Stheno and Euryale, while not detailed extensively in ancient sources, forms an important part of the tradition. These ancient beings, who had presumably protected Medusa, who had lived with her in exile at the world's edge, now confronted her corpse. Pindar's account suggests their response was powerful enough to move even Athena, their wailing becoming the inspiration for the goddess's invention of the flute. They pursued Perseus with all their supernatural speed, flying after him, shrieking and searching. But Perseus had already donned the helm of invisibility. Though the ancient sources describe them pursuing him desperately, they couldn't see him, couldn't catch him. Perseus flew away on Hermes' sandals, Medusa's head secured in its magical bag, leaving the two immortal Gorgons to their grief. Pindar tells us that Athena, moved by the sisters' anguished wailing, invented the double-piped flute, the aulos, to recreate the haunting sound of their mourning, to preserve that grief in music. It's one of the few moments in the entire Perseus myth where anyone seems to acknowledge that something was lost when Medusa died, that someone grieved for her, that her death was not simply a triumph but also a tragedy. The goddess who had cursed Medusa, who had helped Perseus kill her, was nonetheless moved by the sound of her sister's mourning, moved enough to create art from that grief, to ensure that the sound of loss would be remembered. Perseus's journey home became its own series of adventures, each one adding to his growing legend. He stopped in the kingdom of Ethiopia, a mythical African land, not the modern nation, where he found Princess Andromeda chained to a cliff as a sacrifice to a sea monster. Her mother Cassiopeia had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the sea nymphs, the Nereids, and Poseidon had sent a monster to punish this hubris. Perseus, wielding Medusa's severed head like a weapon, turned the sea monster to stone before it could devour Andromeda, saved the princess, and claimed her as his bride. Another woman saved, another monster slain, another hero's deed to add to the growing list. When he finally returned to Seriphos, he found his mother Danae taking refuge in a temple, still fleeing from Polydectes' unwanted advances. The king, convinced Perseus had died on his impossible quest, had been pursuing Danae with renewed aggression, no longer bothering with patience or courtesy. Perseus confronted Polydectes and his entire court at a feast, striding into the hall where they celebrated what they thought was their victory. When the king mockingly demanded proof of his quest's completion, when the court laughed at the presumption of this fisherman's foster son returning alive from an impossible task, Perseus pulled Medusa's head from the cabesus. Every man in the hall, Polydectes included, was instantly transformed into stone, frozen in their final moments of disbelief and fear and mocking laughter. The hall became a gallery of statues, a monument to the king's cruelty and the price of underestimating a son of Zeus. With the false king and his corrupt court eliminated in a single gesture, Perseus made Dictys, the kind fisherman who had saved him and his mother from the sea all those years ago, the new king of Seriphos. Justice was served, at least by the logic of Greek mythology, where violent death is an acceptable response to threatened sexual assault and political manipulation. Then, having completed his quest and avenged his mother, and proven himself a true hero worthy of the name, Perseus turned his attention to returning the divine gifts he'd borrowed. The winged sandals went back to Hermes, presumably to be loaned to some other hero in some other crisis. The helm of invisibility returned to the underworld, back to Hades' treasury of powerful artifacts. The cabesus was given back to the nymphs who had provided it. But the head of Medusa, that terrible trophy, the evidence of his triumph, Perseus gave to Athena, the goddess who had helped him kill her cursed priestess, who had wanted Medusa dead for reasons of her own. Athena accepted the gift. She took Medusa's severed head and affixed it to her aegis, the divine breastplate, placing it at the center of her armor, where it would be visible whenever she appeared in her war aspect. From that moment forward, the goddess of wisdom would carry the face of the woman she had cursed, the priestess she had transformed into a monster, the victim she had helped Perseus to kill. What Athena felt about this, triumph, satisfaction, perhaps something more complex, the ancient sources don't tell us. They record only the action, not the emotion. And so Medusa's death became her most famous moment. Her mythology reduced to this single act of heroic violence. Her complexity erased in favor of a simple narrative. Hero kills monster, world is safer, justice is served, glory is won. The fact that she was asleep, that she was hiding rather than threatening anyone, that she had already been punished beyond measure for crimes she didn't commit, all of this was buried beneath the gleaming reputation of Perseus. the Gorgon Slayer, the hero who faced the impossible and triumphed through courage and divine aid. But Medusa's head retained its power even in death, perhaps especially in death. It could still turn living beings to stone, could still protect or destroy, depending on who wielded it and against whom. In death, Medusa had become a weapon, an object, a tool to be used by gods and heroes for their own purposes. She would never speak again, never defend herself, never tell her own version of events, never ask why she deserved this fate. Yet her face would be everywhere, carved into shields and temples, stamped on coins and pottery, painted on vases and walls, staring out from doorways and tombs, meeting every gaze that dared to look back. And in each of those images, in every representation of her severed head, the question remained unanswered, hanging in the air like Medusa's final scream. Who exactly was the monster in this story? The eternal gaze, legacy, and meaning. As we draw toward the close of our journey through Medusa's story, let your breathing deepen. Let the weight of these ancient tales settle gently around you. We've traveled from the earliest mentions in Hesiod's verses to contemporary reinterpretations, from grotesque, archaic pottery to beautiful classical sculpture, from ancient protective symbols to modern feminist icons. Medusa has been many things to many people across nearly 3,000 years. What makes Medusa remarkable is not any single interpretation, but her persistence across time and culture, her ability to speak to different concerns in different eras. The ancient Greeks saw her primarily as an apotropaic symbol, a protective face that warded off evil. Later periods emphasized her role in Perseus's heroic narrative. Modern interpreters have reclaimed her as a symbol of survival, resistance, and the refusal to be silenced. Medusa endures because her story touches on questions that remain relevant. How do societies treat victims of violence? Who has the power to define what constitutes monstrosity? What happens when the vulnerable are blamed for crimes committed against them? These aren't comfortable questions, and Medusa's myth doesn't offer comfortable answers. It shows us something messy and difficult. Sometimes the innocent suffer. Sometimes the powerful escape consequences. Sometimes justice is delayed or denied entirely. Modern survivors of sexual violence who choose to tattoo Medusa's face on their bodies have given the symbol new meaning, representing transformation, survival, and the refusal to be diminished by trauma. In these contemporary interpretations, the serpents become a crown rather than a curse, the petrifying gaze a boundary and defense rather than an affliction. This reading, while not present in ancient sources, has found powerful resonance with those seeking symbols of empowerment. Feminist scholars who have engaged with Medusa's story aren't claiming to reveal a hidden ancient truth, but rather recognizing patterns that persist. They observe in her myth a structure that appears across cultures and time periods: the blaming of victims, the holding of women responsible for male violence, the transformation of those who speak about abuse into problems that need to be silenced. When French theorist Hélène Cixous wrote The Laugh of the Medusa in 1975, translated into English in 1976, she wasn't describing what ancient Greeks believed. She was challenging centuries of male-dominated interpretation and inviting a radical rereading. You only have to look at the Medusa straight on to see her, and she's not deadly. She's beautiful, and she's laughing. Artists who reimagine Medusa in contemporary works aren't simply rehashing old myths for entertainment. They're participating in the ongoing process of myth-making that has kept Medusa alive for so long, adding their voices to the conversation about what she means, who she was, what her story can teach us. Every new novel that gives her a voice, every painting that shows her expression in the moment before death, every sculpture that reverses the traditional power dynamic between her and Perseus adds another layer to her meaning, another possibility for understanding. And even those who use Medusa's image commercially or politically, even those who weaponize her against powerful women or turn her into a fashion logo, even they are acknowledging her power, her recognizability, her ability to communicate complex ideas with a single glance. You don't spend thousands of years using a symbol if it doesn't work, if it doesn't carry meaning, if it doesn't resonate with something deep in the cultural psyche. Medusa's face, whether we encounter it on ancient pottery in a museum or on a t-shirt in a store, whether we see it in classical sculpture or modern street art, whether we read about her in Ovid or in a contemporary feminist retelling, always does the same thing. It meets our gaze. It looks back at us. It refuses to be simply an object of our looking, insists on being a subject that looks in return, that sees us seeing it, that creates a relationship rather than allowing passive observation. This mutual gaze, this meeting of eyes across whatever medium presents her face, is where Medusa's true power lies. It's not about turning people to stone anymore, though that remains a powerful metaphor for holding perpetrators accountable, for refusing to let harmful behavior continue unchallenged. It's about recognition, about seeing and being seen, about the refusal to disappear or be silenced or become just another forgotten victim in a long history of victims. Medusa has not been forgotten. She has not been silenced. She has not disappeared into the dustbin of ancient mythology that no longer matters. She is more present, more visible, more discussed and debated and reimagined than she has been in centuries, perhaps than she has ever been. The woman who was beheaded speaks more loudly now than most of the gods and heroes who killed her or used her. As you drift towards sleep, let this be your final thought about Medusa. Across nearly 3,000 years, her image has persisted. She was portrayed as monster, as victim, as protective symbol, as warning, as inspiration. Each age has found something different in her face, something that spoke to its particular concerns and fears. The ancient Greeks used her image to ward off evil. Medieval Christians saw her as a symbol of sin. Renaissance artists explored the tension between beauty and horror in her features. Modern feminists have reclaimed her as a symbol of resistance and survival. The stone statues that ancient sources describe surrounding her lair have been read various ways across time, as evidence of her danger in older tellings, as tragic victims in some interpretations, as would-be attackers getting what they deserved in certain modern readings. What we can say with certainty is that the image of Medusa surrounded by stone figures has remained powerful across millennia, though its meaning has shifted with each generation that encounters it. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryala, remained with her through everything, protecting her, mourning her, trying to avenge her. They represent something important too: solidarity, sisterhood, the refusal to abandon someone just because society has declared them monstrous. They knew Medusa before her transformation and stayed with her after. They loved her enough to grieve her death with sounds so haunting that even Athena was moved to immortalize them in music. Perseus is remembered as the hero in ancient sources, but in our modern cultural landscape, Medusa's image has become more recognizable, her story more discussed, her symbolism richer and more complex. This shift isn't about discovering what the myths really meant. It's about each generation finding new relevance in old stories, asking new questions of ancient texts. Athena carries Medusa's face on her aegis in virtually every ancient depiction of the goddess. Modern readers might interpret this as a perpetual reminder of divine injustice, though ancient audiences likely saw it differently, as proof of the goddess's power and protection. Both readings exist simultaneously, neither erasing the other, each revealing something about the time and culture that produced it. The gods fade, but the questions remain. The heroes die, but the symbols endure. The empires crumble, but the stories persist, changing, adapting, speaking to each new generation in languages they understand, through media they use, about concerns they share. Medusa's story, as recorded in ancient sources, began with divine encounters and ended with a hero's sword. How we understand that story, as tragedy, as heroism, as injustice, as necessary monster slaying, has changed dramatically over time and continues to evolve. The myths give us the events. Each generation supplies the meaning. Rest now, let the layers of interpretation settle gently. Ancient protective symbol, medieval demon, Renaissance tragic beauty, modern survivor icon. Medusa has been all of these, and the conversation continues. Her face persists, not because we've finally understood her correctly, but because her story keeps offering new questions, new challenges, new mirrors in which to see ourselves and our societies. The Gorgon's gaze, which turned onlookers to stone in ancient accounts, does something different now in our modern understanding. It invites us to look back, to question, to see clearly what we might prefer to ignore. Whether we interpret her as monster or victim, as threat or symbol of resistance, she demands to be seen. And perhaps that demand, more than any specific interpretation, is her truest power. Sleep da. Knowing that stories change, that victims can become symbols of strength, that the silenced can speak again through those who refuse to let them be forgotten. Sleep well knowing that Medusa's story, like all the best stories, is not finished, will never be finished, continues with each telling, each interpretation, each person who looks at her face and sees not a monster, but a mirror. Good night, and thank you for listening to the untold story of Medusa, the story that's still being told, still being written, still being lived by everyone who refuses to accept that some suffering is inevitable, that some injustice is acceptable, that some voices must remain silent. The Gorgon's gaze softens. The myth continues, and somewhere at the edge of the world, or perhaps right here in our own hearts, Medusa closes her eyes at last, knowing she has been truly seen, finally understood, no longer alone in her exile, but accompanied by everyone who recognizes her story as, in some way, their own. rest, transform, endure. Like Medusa herself, we are more than what was done to us, more than the stories others tell about us, more than the monsters they need us to be. We are human, complex, deserving of bus, worthy of being heard. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate truth the Gorgon's gaze reveals. We all deserve to be seen clearly, honestly, without the distortions of power or the simplifications of narrative convenience. We all deserve to tell our own stories. We all deserve justice, not the justice of mythology, but the justice of a world that believes victims, that holds perpetrators accountable, that protects the vulnerable instead of blaming them. Medusa's story is not over. It's just beginning. And we are all part of it now, all connected by her gaze, all challenged by her questions, all invited to see clearly and to act justly and to never accept that monsters are born rather than made. Sleep now. The serpents are still. The stone has returned to flesh. The victim has become a survivor. The survivor a symbol. The symbol a truth that refuses to die. Good night. And thank you for seeing, really seeing, the woman behind the myth, the person beneath the monster, the truth beyond the legend. Medusa endures, justice awaits. And the story continues, with each of us, forever. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Medusa's story. If you enjoyed this exploration, please subscribe to Sleepable Mythology and let us know in the comments which ancient myth you'd like us to explore next. Rest well, knowing that even the darkest stories can illuminate truths that help us understand ourselves and our world. Good night.